Namaskar. Welcome to the 23rd episode of the Indian AdGeek. My name is Vishal Mehra. If you were to play a game of agency bingo and needed to find one person who has conquered every single square, from the high altitude consulting of Brand Union and the global network machinery of McCann Worldgroup to the legendary creative independence of Forsman and Bodenfors, you'd eventually find yourself at the door of today's guest. He's the global CEO of VR Social, one of the most recognized social-first creative agencies on the planet, under the Plus Company banner. But before he was navigating the chaos of 24-hour trend cycles, he was building brand identities designed to last decades, and apparently honing his skills as a wicketkeeper, which, as any ad geek knows, is the perfect training for catching the fast balls the industry keeps throwing at us. He's a strategist who has moved from the upstream to the always on. Please welcome a man who has lived through every agency iteration imaginable, Toby Southgate.
Hi, Vishal. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you. How did you and advertising happen, Toby?
Love that starting point. I guess it happened because I didn't succeed in my first career, which was aiming to be a professional cricketer. In another world, we'd be having a conversation with each other about the IPL or something like that. But I didn't quite make it. I spent most of my teenage years trying, and was never quite good enough, to be perfectly honest. But it meant that I needed to go to university, get a proper job. And it eventually led me to agencies. But I've got to be honest and say, having studied economics, it was more by luck than judgment. I didn't know about advertising as a career path or even the world of marketing. I did a kind of serious degree subject because it felt like I should do something serious after spending my teenage years playing cricket and probably not hitting the books hard enough. But it was through that and an opportunity that came up. Famously or infamously got a phone call from an agency wanting to talk to me about a job. I knew a little bit about the internet in the early stages, having been part of a publishing startup. And I assumed by agency, they meant recruitment agency. So I arrived in this office that turned out to be a creative agency. And it was, there was music playing, there were fun people hanging around. There was a lot of pictures and images on the walls. It just felt like the kind of place that I wanted to be in. So it was, as I say, more by luck than judgment, but it's been a very happy last 20 plus years getting used to it.
And you have tempted me enough to ask you, did you play cricket as a batsman or a bowler?
I was a wicket keeper first and a batsman second at a time when that was kind of okay. These days I'm not sure. I think you need to.
I remember Jack Russell, one of the greats.
Yeah, me too.
Fantastic wicketkeeper. People don't talk about him enough, but what a wicketkeeper he was.
Sensational. One of my heroes as a kid. And the kind of player who would find it very difficult these days to make his way. I think he was a lower order batsman. I would say he outperformed in his batting career against his talent. But he wouldn't have been comfortable in a T20 environment or playing white ball cricket more than red ball. But no, exactly the kind of player that I looked up to and admired greatly.
Even Ian Healy was very similar. Great wicketkeeper, but you're right. We can have a whole podcast on cricket, but for now, let's go back to advertising. You started with Brand Union, then you moved on to McCann, then to Forsman and Bodenfors, and now at VR Social. Each move crosses a fundamentally different type of an agency. Brand consultancy, global network, creative independent, now social specialist. Is there a coherent thesis running through these moves?
Yeah, I consider myself really lucky to have been in so many of these disciplines, to be perfectly honest. And it wasn't constructed deliberately or purposefully by me at the outset. What happened was, and I think honestly, I encourage more and more people that I speak to in the industry, particularly younger folks coming in, to recognize how broad it is. Marketing generally is really good at making up language and creating isolation or expertise that appears narrow and deep. The world of marketing is super broad and there are multiple disciplines inside of it. And as I started to learn that, again, lucky bounce, my first big agency at least was Brand Union, which was inside WPP. And that gave me a chance because it was focused in brand consulting to see very broadly across the mix. If my first big agency had been, a purist traditional advertising business, I might still be in it. But the early days of design led and brand consulting or design thinking and brand consulting naturally gave me a pretty broad view because those kinds of businesses absolutely need to collaborate and bring in other skills and capabilities in order to execute or help a client execute against a strategy for a brand, advertising, CRM, activation, experiential, internal comms, employee branding, and all of these disciplines sit within this wider world. So whenever I had a chance to go and explore something slightly adjacent but very different in terms of core competence, I've jumped at it, and I think that has been, it might have been to my detriment on occasion when, the next vertical progression might have been close or in front of me. But I'm a big believer in horizontal progression as well. Sometimes taking a step to the side and seeing a new area or a new discipline up close is the best thing you can do. So yeah, it's not been constructed purposefully, but I'm very glad that I've been able to or comfortable jumping into things that sound a little, perhaps sound a little glamorous or different at first, but that give me some insight into another capability set.
You started straight away with more upstream consulting work and then you moved across streams in your following roles. I want to talk about your current role for a bit. We Are Social's mantra is being socially led. From your vantage point, does this mean social is the new lead agency effectively displacing the traditional ATL shop? Or is social simply the more accurate mirror of culture that informs the rest of the mix?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a couple of important things to frame my answer. One is, and I love this about We Are Social. Very specifically, our name creates some implied expertise, right? And also very specifically, We Are Social is not We Are Social Media, right? It very specifically is a comment on the human condition, how we learn, how we share, how we tell stories, how we engage people, how we build relationships. And I think lots of the learning that the agency's built over 16 or 17 years, while obviously and implicitly tied to an emerging and tremendously high growth channel, if you want to call that social media, it informs and evolves brand thinking at a higher level as well. And that for me is super interesting. It's not about one thing replacing another. I think there are places and moments and brands and specific briefs or business objectives, as I said, that require multiple disciplines from across this mix. I still think there is a brand governance specifically and particularly for more traditional or legacy brands. There's a brand governance role that perhaps some of the agencies you're referring to in terms of traditional ATL businesses, that they really are some of the best people to steward those long-term, more consistent and globally demanding brand platforms. Although I think those cases are becoming fewer and fewer, and it's quite kind of interesting. We're having this conversation, 72 hours or whatever it is after, one of the longest standing, most impactful traditional agency legacy brand relationships is Ogilvy and IBM, one of the most famous advertising brands ever, and still the case, and one of the most famous technology businesses ever that went through one of the most dramatic pivots ever, and brand led, right? And Ogilvy was a true partner through that process in a way that very, very few other businesses could have served that role. So I don't think there's in fact, even lead agency might be the thing I would challenge. I think a lead agency implies there's only one way to build brands. And I think 50 or 70 years ago, broadcast media would have been the one way. In 2026 and beyond, there are multiple ways to build brands and multiple obstacles and challenges as you grow. And how you use as a marketer, as a client, how you use the mix of skills and tools and channels available to you, that is where the disruption and the displacement is happening, because there are so many choices and so many potential routes to market.
Social media agency as a category was invented by the industry to describe something platforms, primarily Facebook, I would say, made possible. Now that every agency from Ogilvy to the smallest independent shop claims social fluency, what is the defensible proprietary thing that a specialist social agency actually does better? And there's an uncomfortable argument running alongside that the era of the dedicated social agency is ending and that every agency now is a social agency.
I think every creative company needs to have some kind of awareness, not only of the platforms themselves, but, and this is, I think, the most important bit, how people behave and want to communicate and engage within them. And that changes over time. You wanted to do something rather different on Facebook when it started up than you might do today. And the platforms, as they grow and evolve, are offering more and different services themselves. So I think if you use the phrase, is there an uncomfortable argument alongside? I mean, there is. It's the discomfort, if you like, of some of the existential challenges facing the industry as a whole. And it's really important to remember in that regard that the industry as a whole, the big marketing services industry as a whole, that wider world, is not exclusively the domain of big global holding company owned creative companies. In fact, there are more people employed in small, independent, local, regional specialists than there are in the big holding companies put together. That's true in pretty much every market in the world. But obviously, because of the kind of industrial complex of holding companies, there is a natural need for those businesses and their bigger agencies to evolve. And what you're seeing in most of those holding companies at the moment is some kind of the consolidation that you're describing. Fewer brands, broader base of services within those brands, and in some cases, the what's the right word? The relegation of the importance and influence of an agency brand in its own right under the brand influence that the holding company itself believes it can take forward and communicate more effectively. So the creation of WPP Creative, in which will sit Ogilvy, VML, what's the other? AKQA, I think, is the other brand, at the loss of some of those other very famous creative brands that used to sit within WPP, J. Walter Thompson, Wunderman, Gray, to name just a handful. That change is real, and that change is a reaction to some of those dynamics in the market, the uncomfortable arguments that you mention, and those are real, because an agency claiming something while evolving, having been something else for a very long time, is a different thing to understanding that some businesses have been built for and to exclusively serve clients in this specific era. And again, whether if the agency wants to describe themselves as a social media agency, that's a narrowing of a specialism. If you want to describe yourselves as a creative agency born in social, or a social first or culture first creative agency, that's something rather different. And then, of course, you have to live up to those commitments and promises. But you're right to point out the discomfort, because there's a lot of change happening in our world at the moment, and most of it is happening at that layer, frankly, above and around We Are Social. We aren't owned by a public holding company. And our group, our creative collective around us plus company, is just a few thousand people in 3 or 4 key brands, rather than hundreds of thousands of people in what used to be 60 or 70 or 80 key brands trying to reorganize and realign themselves. So I think understanding what you are and where you play in that world, and that within it, there is a lot of opportunity for everyone, as long as you're clear on what you're here for, what you're expert in, and why you do things a little bit differently to others. Doesn't mean better or worse, just means differently and in your way. And for us at We Are Social, that way has been very consistent for 16 or 17 years. It's to be both global, which is very rare for a specialist built from our space. In fact, we're probably unique, truly, and be comfortable talking about our capabilities as a creative agency as well. But as you described it earlier, a socially led creative agency.
When you're at an industry gathering and there are so many different folks around you, different opinions flying around, something which keeps coming up is the future of social media, right? And especially brands get slightly twitchy when they talk about how they don't own their audience on these social mediums or on these social platforms, right? Facebook owns it or X owns it. And then there's this question of how does one see social media evolving further? What's next for social media? Because there's a certain level of fluency and certain level of expertise that agencies and the talent in agencies have built up about these platforms. The consumers are also now a bit more savvier. Is there a thinking, We Are Social has on what's next as far as social networks are concerned, and respectively what kind of work we might see in the future?
I think there's a handful of things that drive towards that. I mean, one of them, and just to be, I guess, to be super direct about it, any brand with a communications challenge that isn't exploring properly and strategically which platforms it uses for what kind of communication or to reach whichever audience it is they want to speak to. If they're not doing that already, then they're already behind. Our view is that there's going to be, and there is already, deeper specialism and relevance for certain brands in certain places, and spreading bets very thinly. Imagine if you're a brand, you used to have a handful of choices as to where you communicated and how. Today you have almost, infinite small amounts of money, like walking into a casino with infinite pennies and being able to spread them around, every table, every bet, every number. I'm not a big gambler, so I'm stretching the analogy a little bit. But our view is always that whatever the number of pennies in your pocket, clarity on who it is you're trying to reach and what you can credibly say to them in ways that will resonate with them as human beings, wherever they are. Now, those are the things that can make the biggest difference. And we talk a lot about this sort of, if you want to call it, the fragmentation of media, creating a position where it simply doesn't matter how much of a media budget or a marketing budget you have. There is no guarantee that you can buy the reach or the influence or the audience or the conversion that you might want or expect. There's no amount of money that can guarantee it. So being smart, being clever, being relevant, and truly understanding the objectives of your campaign, your brand, and your business strategy, that will help you put those pennies in the right places. And certainly spreading them across the whole table is not a smart spend. There's that very old, people attribute this to lots of different individuals, but an old truism that 50% of my marketing budget is working, I just don't know which half. Well, it shouldn't be the case that today that still applies, because you can be very targeted and very specific, very performance driven and very measured. But that's not the whole story, right? It's particularly not the whole story when you don't actually own the data, as is often the case with some of these platforms. So lots of our work, and in fact, it's still the core of our business, is helping brands define for themselves in channels that they can own and with data they can control and influence what their brand stands for in social. It's not possible on some of the bigger, broader platforms, but the bigger, broader platforms cannot be the only answer. What you do in live events, in activations, partnership, sponsorship on your own brand channels, you can and you do have the opportunity to build and engage directly. And that can be remarkably helpful for brands.
For the benefit of our listeners, Plus Company is a partnership model rather than a traditional holding company, and it's backed by CVC Capital Partners. After years inside WPP and McCann, what is that specific legacy stuff? Maybe it's structural, financial, cultural, you've been able to leave behind, Toby. And how does the PE backing change your 5 year roadmap? Is there more pressure for aggressive M&A or more freedom to ignore short-termism? Like a
Well,
traditional holding company, rather.
yeah, sure. It's a great question, and I think you use the word partnership, and I'd probably start with that. It is very different, and I was commenting earlier about sort of opportunistic career moves, and definitely one of the reasons I wanted to join We Are Social and take on this role was because of the structure and the model and the backing of private equity. And I wanted to take on that challenge for two specific reasons. One is to test the prevailing narrative, which is private equity, singular focus, investment returns, and therefore immense pressure. And I wasn't sure I bought that, but certainly there's more private equity interest in the wider world of marketing than ever. So it was really important for me to take on, to take the opportunity to see if it's true. And then secondly, the ways in which the agencies themselves are encouraged to behave and operate inside of Plus Company, the partnership model, as you describe it, almost, it's not a holding company as much as it is a support network. And that's really powerful to me. It's a very human perspective on things. And my experience so far, I've been getting to know this company for 18 months or so, and I've been in the role for 14 months or so. Is that the pressure is fair and reasonable, and frankly, way less invasive than it is in more traditional holding companies. Those traditional holding companies, I worked at WPP under Martin, and I worked at McCann Worldgroup when it was inside IPG, and a pretty significant part of it. The reporting pressure that goes with talking to the markets every 3 months about how you're doing, how you expect to do, and what your plans are to catch up if you're behind, or to continue over delivering if you're over delivering, is, let's just say, it's felt throughout the business and throughout all the agencies within the business, because it's a part of the management dialogue. You are actively in dialogue purely on commercials almost constantly, particularly if you're a CEO. And to quote a former boss, I won't say which one, the only cure for a bad quarter is a good quarter, because the eyes of investors and the public markets are on your performance. Now, in contrast to that, in this landscape, I went out of my way to understand what our investors expect of us. And all I'll say, the returns, expectation of returns is very reasonable, and the time frame is significantly longer than a cure for a bad quarter is a good quarter. They're in PE works essentially in cycles, and their focus and their expectations are that through the course of a cycle, you're managing the business to growth. And that I've actually find quite empowering. It's good to know that you have support and backing for a relatively and comparatively long term. And the performance of our business and Plusco generally through 2025 was testament to that. We were able to focus on things that move the needle for the mid to long term rather than fill short-term holes, which is almost inevitably the position that any business would ultimately find itself in if you are looking literally week on week, month on month, quarter on quarter, and having to report in detail on what can be micro changes, because the micro changes add up to the overarching performance. And my expectations here have been met. They're very, our owners and our management team are super clear on what they expect, and super comfortable backing decisions that operators need to make in order to continue working towards those objectives. So it's no more or less pressured commercially, but day to day, operationally, the freedom, the kind of entrepreneurialism, if you like, and the partnership and support that we feel from Plus Company is deep and meaningful.
That's good to know. At Brand Union, you build brands designed to last decades. At We Are Social, you manage brands that have to survive 24-hour trend cycles. What does your brand union background tell you about the mistakes social agencies make when they engage with brand strategy? And conversely, what mistakes do brand consultants make when they venture into social?
Yeah, very good. I mean, there's a couple of things there. I loved your point about the speed of cycles and very definitely. I mean, my training at Brand Union was about building, I guess, brand platforms is probably a good word. Like, what does this brand stand for strategically, and how does that manifest visually, and how do you organize and rally businesses behind that? And the myopia of traditional brand consulting is that if you have that, it's easy to execute. And as long as you're executing it, you are operating with strategic intent and purpose. And of course, that's subject to change, to whims, to market conditions. And what's true when you define that strategy for a brand can be disrupted fairly quickly through M&A activity is a classic one. Conflict in markets in which you operate is another one. So I think brand consultants can get very precious about the work that they do. And if they are operating in the context of connected interdisciplinary teams that trust each other and properly collaborate towards shared goals, that's when brand strategy can really make a difference for the long term. It's only ever in partnership with other disciplines within that broader mix. If you flip to social first businesses, I think it is very, very tempting. And of course, you have the ability to do this when communication cycles are short. You can publish very quickly. Content on social, to a greater or lesser extent, is relatively quick to make, to publish, to share, to measure. If it's not working, you can change it. It's relatively easy to experiment. And the concern you might have is that it's also very easy for brands and the agencies that represent them to jump with 2 feet into trends that might not perhaps be appropriate or relevant. And that can appear incredibly clumsy to audiences and to real people out in the world. And where there's a kind of fight for authenticity and credibility, the last thing you want is a brand that has no right having a position or taking a voice in something, trying to do precisely that just because they can, right? That lacks credibility and authenticity, which, whether you are a 75-year-old gentleman in London, England, who only gets his news from one very specific newspaper and treats it as gospel, or a 14-year-old young female in Jakarta whose entire communication landscape is multi-channel, multi-discipline, mobile first, multiply sourced, almost ephemeral in the way that it comes and goes, but comfortable piecing together your own perspective based on tens or hundreds of inputs. Then, whether it's right for a brand to take a position in a channel, you're going to have a reaction to that immediately. So I think there's a lot to learn in both. And frankly, if you understand, it's the best kind of training. If you understand the fundamentals of human behavior, what drives people to make decisions and what influences them, then if you believe that marketing is an art and a science, there are things that brand consultants can learn from social specialists and vice versa. And I hope that, that's part of the beauty of the landscape. I hope it continues to be the case.
Social platforms have fragmented brand audiences into communities of one. Every algorithm delivers a different version of a brand to a different user. Toby, how do you advise a CMO to maintain a timeless brand identity when their primary touchpoint is an Instagram feed? And do you believe social media has made brands too accessible for their own good?
That's a good question. If you're comfortable being judged, right, you can be a little bolder in what you share. I mean, there's a good reason why lots of brands, plenty of them do it themselves, by the way, but there's a very good reason why lots of brands pay supremely close attention to what they share in social, because it can be it can change quite quickly, but it's also something that you have immediate judgment on and public judgment. So I think too accessible is a super interesting phrase, right? Do people want Do brands want growth at all costs? If growth equates to followers, supporters, positive commentary, or are you measuring sentiment and growth and expansion along with all the usual commercial targets that a brand might have? But I think there's sort of one fundamental that I go back to, which is why are you doing any of this anyway? To publish on Instagram or to run a press campaign or a TV ad, you've got to have a purpose behind it. What is that purpose? Is the very first question that we should be asking our clients. And maybe the answer is not an Instagram post or a TV spot or an out-of-home campaign. Maybe the answer is an internal comms program or an employee engagement initiative or an event or a partnership. And unless you get to that sort of core intent behind the brief, behind the task, and you understand what that brand or business aims to achieve with its marketing initiatives, you're really just experimenting unless you can answer that question very clearly. And I see consistently people, brands, and in agencies who can't answer that question. They're executing because they have a brief that requires them to execute something without necessarily enough strategic intent behind it. And that can be problematic. That needs attention. And it's honestly probably what differentiates agencies that can serve as true partners to people who can execute for brands. And there's lots of both. There always has been, and there always will be. But I think that it's starting with the core question. I won't make this about We Are Social, but I learned a lot from working at Forsman Bodenfors, which is this beautifully precious, incredibly creative place, born in Sweden, with an iconic relationship of geography, client, and agency brand that exists, quite rarely. Apple, TBWA Media Arts Lab, and the West Coast of America might be one. Nike, Wyden, and Portland might be another. But Volvo, Forsman, and Gothenburg is very definitely one of those holy triangles. And we would get, the agency did a lot of work for Volvo over 3 decades and still does. And in every brief, there would be the big things and the small things. And some of the things could become executional quite quickly in the context of, let's call it a launch for a new car. And the questions the agency would always ask itself were the same. And the answer that the clients would always give were the same. It was, if you really get behind it, what does this ladder up to? What are we communicating? And what is the objective of this communication? And with Volvo, almost exclusively, and in my opinion, exquisitely, whoever's making the work, wherever it exists, like the message is safety, right? If any car makes a piece of communication that describes how safe that car is, they're really making a Volvo ad. And then the intent is super, super simple. And right the way up to the CEO of Volvo Cars, the answer would be, this ladder's up to, guess what? Sell more cars. That's it. Everything else is a means to that end. And if you're solid and consistent and clear on the strategy and what makes that brand different, which is an impeccable long-term commitment to safety, which is expressed in very powerful and meaningful ways. If you can get to that, the work becomes relatively easy, and you get away from the risk of tactical executional focus.
We are seeing platforms converge. Instagram is doing long form video to some extent. YouTube, of course, is now firmly in shorts. TikTok deeply in search. Pinterest doubling down on shopping. When every platform becomes every other platform, what happens to the craft of platform native content strategy? Something that most clients and brands would want. And I can tell you that as somebody who's been in the agency world for almost 2 decades now, and I'm sure you've had that experience too.
Great, it's a great question, and it has to adapt, right? I think the convergence, the evolution, the extension of these platforms, right? TikTok Shop is a big conversation for a lot of brands wanting to take control of their retail channel at the moment. And you can't begin to advise effectively on how to use these channels or begin to experiment with them until you really understand that background objective. What are we trying to achieve here through these channels and with this marketing plan? Now there's both craft and tactics here, right? There's a lot of change, a lot of flux. It's easy to overlook that bigger question, which is it right for us to do this? Is it right to experiment with TikTok Shop? And if so, how do we structure it in a way that insulates us in other channels and contains the impact, positive and negative, while we learn more and educate ourselves? This has been one of the most, I guess, the most rewarding things about the last 14 months or so is getting to understand how much, by the nature of the work that we do and the space where we're expert in, we're learning as we go. And it's a really good thing to talk about that openly with clients because it means we don't have a predetermined answer. Inevitably, then it means we're getting to that answer together and learning together as we go. And what's right for one brand in a certain space, automotive brands aren't going to sell on TikTok Shop, but should they be using content on TikTok that is adjacent to their own Instagram channel, seeding with influencers messages around a new vehicle launch, communicating the adjacencies between their retail product and their partnership or sponsorship in motor racing. All of these things can come from the same discussion and the same brief. So understanding the overlaps, understanding that there's value still in platform native content, and even more so if it is absolutely delivering on broader brand strategy objectives, sitting comfortably with and alongside other social first platforms, and if it's delivering its intentions and objectives for the brand. So I think you used the word craft, and there is craft in that. But it can never achieve everything all on its own, right? And understanding and learning and evolving as you go, I think, and understanding what that means in terms of broader brand objectives and social strategy, that's the right way to communicate. Understand those objectives, evolve and adapt as you make progress.
For a lack of a better word, dark social, WhatsApp groups, private discords, closed communities, is where some of the most potent brand conversations actually happen. Yet they are almost entirely unmeasurable. I'm a big aviation geek and spend a lot of time on fly talk. How does an agency justify strategic investment in a channel it fundamentally cannot report on?
I would not specifically in I think you used the phrase dark social, but I'll pick up on something that you said that really resonated, which is what you find in lots of these communities and groups is, and even if they're closed or relatively closed, they are, as you know from from your own life and your own passions and interests, they are incredibly powerful and compelling. When you bring people together, this is the original intent of social media, right? Bring people together on the basis of shared passions, fandoms, things people get excited and engaged by, and give them an opportunity to expand their influence and their networks, their world. And flight talk you referenced, and it just reminded me of something I was looking at earlier today. We have so part of the job for us is making sure that we describe it as being chronically online, and that doesn't mean living on the internet 24 hours a day. It does mean understanding that there are things happening on the internet 24 hours a day that for some of our brands at certain moments create opportunities for them to engage within those communities in ways that are resonant and meaningful to the communities and the fandoms in which they want to take part. Jumping on those opportunities is hard because social moves very quickly and you don't know how long that trend is going to last. And even harder is to define how that brand can jump into that trend credibly rather than clumsily. And if it's clumsy, the judgment is immediate. So I was thinking of this work that I saw from our team in Australia does a lot of work with KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. And they had picked up that a community of fitness influencers, you used the word flight talk, gym talk, was full of health and fitness experts, personal trainers, influencers in the space, um, kind of pirating, hacking the KFC menu to get protein, to boost their protein intake. And they were doing this obviously entirely independent of KFC influence or sponsorship or support. But they would create a TikTok, talk about what they'd ordered and why, give grams of protein counts for specific orders, provide custom orders if you were trying to do a certain kind of training. And this community was super active in a very short space of time, and as an extension to really understanding the KFC brand in the market, really understanding the competitive dynamics at play, really understanding the client's objectives, both from a comms and a business standpoint, our team put together an idea where we packaged up 4 gym bags of merchandise personalized to 4 specific selected gym talk influencers. And we essentially outed them and said, "Look, you're doing this to our menu. Let's bring you in. We'd love to learn more. Why don't you join us in the KFC test kitchen and help us create a dish just for you, Vishal? You know, Vishal the Magnificent, right? Bodybuilder from West Sydney." And these individuals obviously were creating content for themselves and their own channels as they go in a very platform native way, in a very credible and authentic way. And they were then filmed in the KFC test kitchen working on dishes. And the original suggestion was that these 4 influencers would create a dish each, and they would be featured on the KFC menu in store for 2 weeks. It was so successful that they've already extended the 2 weeks to 6 months and are looking at how to roll the program forwards and perhaps even make it a permanent component of their social marketing strategy. But that's the kind of thing that those closed communities can do. They provide and are fueled by passions and interests, which are the very things that marketers have always wanted to tap into. Social allows brands with the right guidance and the right strategy to do that with credibility and with resonance, and to avoid the clumsiness and the overbearingness that can come with it. But that, if you have the strategy, you have the relationship, you understand the brand, you can see and actively demonstrate what's happening in communities online, then you can give clients and brands an opportunity to jump into them in ways that create results they wouldn't otherwise expect.
I'm gonna look that up.
Yeah, I'll send it.
Toby, Reddit has emerged as a major research and discovery touchpoint, particularly in finance, tech, health. Yet brands have historically fumbled, I would say, every attempt to engage there authentically. Every few months, a new platform comes out with user momentum. You know, there's Be Real, Lemonade, Blue Sky has been around for some time. How do you build an agency recommendation framework that helps clients decide when to enter early versus wait for proof of scale without simply chasing away every new shiny object or every shiny new social network?
Another good question. I think that the Reddit is a good example of, sort of builds on the prior discussion actually. Like Reddit is a place where real conversations happen. And we know, and we measure this. We publish every year the Global Digital Report, which is, you know, probably the foremost research asset in terms of measuring internet usage, channel activation, who's using what, where, and when. And we publish that annually and share it publicly. One of the things we learned this year is, and this is a data point that I picked out, and I constantly refer to because Reddit is overlooked. Reddit is essentially the mass manifestation of something that social businesses and clients adept in social have been aware of for some time, which is the real talk happens in the comments, right? And it's not only the post, it's the dialogue that the post creates. And in that dialogue are opportunities to understand and learn more about whether that post itself has landed, but also what people who care about and are paying attention to your channels are talking about in response. So the data point that I'll give to you, and this blew my mind, 40% of Reddit posts, 22 billion or so posts at the moment, 40% mention a brand or a product. 4 in 10 Reddit posts mention a brand or a product, and none of them have been paid for by a brand. So yes, is that an overlooked space for learning more about what the world is saying about your brand or your product? For sure. And so we've actually published quite a lot on this over the last few months, just to open people's eyes, marketers' eyes to the value of understanding that a strand of your marketing or social strategy that considers what's happening in Reddit, measures it, monitors it, pays attention to it, and is building plans to react and engage with insight and information you can derive from that channel, super powerful. And then as for the new ones, because you could call Reddit one of these new ones, certainly new in terms of under leveraged on the whole, for sure. Other platforms emerge, some are market specific. You mentioned Be Real. We ran a campaign not so long ago in France where Be Real is pretty significant for a skincare brand called Avena that outperformed all their other channels. What's relevant for the brand and the market at that moment in time. And it's our job to understand on behalf of our clients and our brands what is relevant for their brand in the markets in which they're operating or trying to penetrate or trying to build new audiences or grow or come back from a defeat against another brand, whatever it might be. And again, that one of the great strengths of social is that ability to experiment. And you can do that relatively quickly, relatively cost effectively, and with great data and response. So yeah, it's understanding the landscape and behaving in ways that are, as we describe it, chronically online, gives us a sense of what's useful at any moment. And we can do that, of course. We're very well connected around the agency. We've got 1,200 or so people in 17 countries. So we do have a properly global point of view, and consistently that's a reason why we're able to build the relationships that we do with the brands that we serve.
Toby, you were talking about how Reddit comments, about 40% of those comments have brand mentions, and all of them are organic, and how the quality of those comments reflect the quality of that post or that piece of content, right? One of my favorite websites, and I keep telling everybody this example because I just love it, is the Cranky Flyer. Okay, it's an aviation website, more of analysis. But the greatest thing about Cranky Flyer, Toby, is if there's a 500 word article, right, written by Brett, there are at least, with every article, there are 100 comments.
Yeah.
And most of the cases, you learn more from the comments than from the article itself, because he has nurtured such a strong community. I love it. I want to go back to something you were talking about earlier, that you keep telling young people in the industry that marketing is just not this, marketing is this, right? There are so many different things in the world of advertising and marketing. You have recently drawn a distinction between influencers who bring reach and makers who bring that native platform expertise. I wanted to know from a P&L perspective, is the future of VR Social to become a large decentralized production house of makers? Do you see yourself becoming more like a talent agency? How do you see that going forward? Because influencer marketing, of course, is such an important part of what we do and how we ideate and how so many of our campaigns come to life now.
Yeah, it's a great question. We talk about this a lot internally, and actually we talk about it a lot, particularly because we feel that we've done. I can't say whether this was by design or not, because I'm only 14 months in, but I really like this distinction. We have always considered the value and potential of bringing influencers, creators, makers into our work for brands. And we have specifically not set up a standalone influencer business. Some people did that. There are influencer agencies exist, and our thesis on this is pretty straightforward. It's that if you understand the needs of the brand first, then you're much better placed to advise on what combination of influencers, creators, makers, and for what purpose you bring them in. So to answer your question from a P&L perspective, we're definitely not interested in becoming a large decentralized production shop. Those exist, and they're a different business model. They serve a different kind of audience. It's very much about volume. It's very much about adaptation, translation, transcreation, execution, asset management, and manipulation. And there's a huge influence there, and opportunity too, depending on your point of view. But that's a place that is already changing very quickly due to new technologies and particularly the emergence of Gen AI tools in production processes. So we're not going to do that, and nor are we becoming, a talent management business. It's that distinction that we drew and will continue to draw between, understanding why you're using these levers. If you want reach, then influencers are a media channel. If you want platform fluency and credibility in communities, you probably want narrower, more specialist creator influencers who are kind of hybrids already. And that's a lot of the emerging talent we're seeing coming into the industry. It's people who wouldn't want to be pigeonholed as one or the other. Increasingly, influencers come with, particularly if they're high profile, they come with production models of their own, and they want an awful lot of control, frankly. And maybe they've deserved that. And for some brands, that's a good thing at the moment, right? It may change, but that's how we see the world. Like these, I guess it's one of the things about being 16, 17 years old in our world, as an agency, is to have been there from the beginning. And, YouTube's 20 years old and we were born just a couple of years after. So I think for us, it is the focus on the brand and our ability to help brands understand what's right for them through a social first creative lens. And there will be other, influencer didn't necessarily exist as a standalone discipline, but we were always alert to the value of influencers in certain channels, to the importance of creators and makers in certain communities, and to credibility in those places on behalf of the brands that we represent. So it will always be a combination of these things.
We are seeing more brands, especially in gaming and entertainment, bypassing agencies entirely and building their own creator networks and content studios in house. What's your take on how far in housing will go? And where does it actually stop? What's that unhouseable value proposition that VR Social offers to a client who believes they can hire three platform native Gen Z creators and do it themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in housing can you can also call that a trend because I think it oscillates over time. There are moments where um, brands and businesses want to bring marketing capabilities in-house. And there are famous examples of that going tremendously badly. The Pepsi ad with Kylie Jenner being one, my favorite maybe. But it's like a pendulum that swings back and forth. And I've always found a couple of things to be true. Number one, there are certainly things that clients could and should be building for themselves in-house if they're interested in properly engaging and owning their marketing discipline. Some brands don't want to do that. They want to run it through a traditional marketing function with lots of external partners. And again, neither one is right or wrong. But the thing I think about it is through the lens of talent. And in my experience, great creative brains, whether they're strategy leaders or creative leaders, writers, makers, great creative brains want to be broad. And by definition, if you go in-house, you are choosing to work on a specific brand, maybe a small portfolio of brands, but a brand or a brand owner. And that can be intensely challenging, very rewarding, and targeted at something very specific, can be tremendously enjoyable, I'm sure. And I also know that people get tired quite quickly, particularly creative brains, and creative brains want to be stretched. And so an agency environment that can work across categories, across markets, across different kinds of briefs at different moments, have that ability to shift around channels and to play a role collaboratively in the context of broader client agency teams with other disciplines represented. That is oxygen and fuel for some people. So exactly as brands can oscillate back and forth between how much they want to in-house and how much they want to outsource in times of economic challenge, by the way, it's obvious that brands want to divest of some of those things that they can invest in at moments of growth. But I think you see that talent can oscillate as well. There'll be moments where people want. If I was a writer or an art director working, and I loved sport, I might have taken a move at one point in time to join a sports brand ahead of an Olympics or a World Cup. Whether I would have stayed with that brand for 5 or 10 years, I don't know. I don't know. So I think creative brains tend to like choice and flexibility and to move around a little bit. But the truth is these things coexist. They always have done and they always will. I think it's important not to be dogmatic about it.
The retainer model is under sustained client pressure. Project work is episodic and margin volatile. Performance-based fees requires agencies to share in outcomes they can't fully control. Which of these three roads does the commercial future of agencies lie on, according to you?
I think there are some choices for agencies to make, to be perfectly honest. And I can say without fear of contradiction here, we are socialists super familiar with the first of those two models and less familiar with performance or outcome-based pricing. And I would like to explore that more. Retainers and projects, I think in traditional agencies, retainers, remember where retainers came from, right? Retainers came when creative work was funded as a percentage of a media budget. And as soon as those disciplines were torn apart, creative agencies had to find a way to charge for their work. And the retainer was a nice and familiar construct for, let's say, legacy clients, legacy agencies, legacy leaders. But increasingly, those retainers were built on the basis of time and hours and rates. And therefore they lean automatically towards, more piecemeal approaches. Projects enable you, if you can avoid the time and hours based pricing rate card model. It's a different flavor of the same challenge, but they're built the same way. And actually, if you look back into history as well, which we all should do because it's a great place to learn, if there's a trend for big agencies to think that all the managing projects and moving to project based is a bad thing and we're unfamiliar with it, then there are lots of examples where creative companies have always been project based. Brand consulting has always been project based, very rarely retained, because by its nature, the program you're working on, which can be very long term and certainly have a very long term impact, but by its nature, it's a project, a rebrand, a repositioning, a piece of post-merger identity development and brand strategy. These things are projects. So learning from both sides is important. Moving to outcome-based pricing, I think you need a clean slate. With new clients, it's possible in any agency environment to have that discussion. And if you are willing to acknowledge that there are multiple pieces, multiple inputs, and not every degree of impact is measurable. So understanding the core and simple KPIs and taking part in investing in the growth of that brand or that business, I think that's a really healthy discussion that is in practice tremendously difficult to execute. It's difficult for clients because at some stage in the conversation, they will want to understand the real impact and accountability of something that can only in very unusual circumstances be isolated. And from the agency side, ultimately there's risk. There's risk and investment required ahead of potential reward. And we are human capital businesses. most of our assets come and go every day, and certainly the thing we spend the most money on comes and goes every day. Those people need to be protected. And if you are, a small startup trying to build something, the idea of investing in growth and helping a brand, you know, succeed disproportionately and playing a part in that is very compelling. But the practical reality is you have overheads, people to pay, offices to fund, and ultimately that's the only thing you have to sell. Your people's brains and the time they spend solving client problems. So it will become a hybrid inevitably. I think it will become a hybrid. But I like if you were building something from scratch, I would like the ability to make a choice and to build a model that can support all three.
In your past life, Toby, you were the chief growth officer for McCann, right? I'm just curious, since the time you have arrived at We Are Social, what has been your new business philosophy, and is there a way you have gone about how you approach growth, business growth at We Are Social since the time you have come on board?
Yeah, it's I've certainly tried to share some experience and some perspective. I have a very strongly held view that, on the whole, agencies pitch too much and for things they don't understand enough about. And it's probably the only professional services industry I can imagine where we routinely compete and give away the thing we hope one day to get paid for. And that's a systemic problem, right? It's also incredibly tempting to say yes. So most agencies, when they're invited to take part in a pitch, will say yes and start without taking a pause and asking the right kinds of questions. My position broadly is that we should start by saying no and find a reason to take part. Start by saying no, because saying no is very powerful, and you can say no politely and elegantly, and in ways that are appropriate and that usually create another discussion. We'd love to, but we're extremely busy looking after these two clients at the moment. Tell us a little bit more about the process. If the process is we want to meet with 10 agencies, invite 8 of them to give us a credentials presentation, then cut to 6 and give them a test strategic brief, you know how that conversation can go. And still agencies on the whole feel they need to play the game. My point of view is, we have, like every agency, we have a bunch of clients who are long-standing relationships, who know us well, who represent a good majority of our revenue base, and almost all of them have relationships with other agencies too, for good reason, but also for some not so good reasons. Maybe those clients don't know that we have people in Dubai or Singapore or Sydney who they could also be working with. Maybe they don't know we have a capability in influencer marketing. There are lots of reasons for it. But my view is that organic growth, keeping the clients you've got, looking after them, growing with them, and doing your best work for them is the most sustainable route to agency growth. New business isn't a component of it, but you tend to, and my experience at McCann Worldgroup back this up, you tend to win more if you pitch less, because then you focus on the things that you are really right for, that are the right shape, size, scale, competitive environment. You've probably built a relationship through the process that makes the ultimate decision inevitable, which you can't do if you're in a beauty parade against 9 other businesses that do vaguely common things but are all fundamentally different. A good friend of mine, a guy who I think of very highly, a guy called Robin Bond, who does a lot of, is a seasoned agency new business person who now does a lot of coaching and training in this space, has the belief that the agency landscape is not oversupplied, it is under differentiated. And the job of an agency is to make sure that its people know what it's there to do, and that its clients and potential customers know what it and only it can do for them. And I like that. I admire the clarity of thinking. And I think agencies too often try to be too many things to too many people, rather than being clear and convicted about what it is that they can do that others can't.
Compliments to Robin. That's
It's a nice thought, right?
that's a lovely way to look at it. The long term brand building versus short term performance debate, popularized by Binney and Field, was built on TV and offline media data. Does the framework translate to social? And does the evidence actually support the idea that social can do genuine brand building work?
Absolutely. I'm a subscriber and a believer in this theory. And the key is the word and. It's not the long or the short of it. It always was both. And I think more and more, brands that are not winning on social are going to find it harder and harder to win, period. And that requires a view on both the longer term brand strategy and the short term tactics and activations you require to grow. Every example I can point to over the last few years of brands doing only one or the other is a route to is a route to decline and failure. Nike is the obvious one, right? Nike over-indexed on performance marketing at the expense of brand for 3 or 4 years immediately in and after COVID. And it led to them being
And they, I
overtaken.
think, exited retail also in a lot of places.
Yeah,
They focused more on their own website.
exactly right. And it led to a CEO being fired, a decline in brand and business value, and Adidas overtaking them in most markets in the world. And that happened in 4 years. And and that happening at the same time, by the way, as new economy businesses like Airbnb realizing that in order to further expand and cement their reputation, the short-term focus on acquiring users needed to convert into longer-term loyalty and going from, app downloads and occasional use of the platform as a research tool to booking, committing, managing trips and travel and vacation through the platform. And they invested in the brand and in advertising the brand and communicating it, in more traditional above the line channels and on social and very digitally active, obviously. But that created immense business growth and expansion for a business that had already done incredibly well in a very short space of time. So yeah, I'm a big believer in it, and it's a core component of We Are Social's thinking. Is a brand, a social first brand agency is another way to describe socially led creative agency. We need to understand the brands we're representing and what they want to achieve in the long term and in the short term.
Sure. And my last question, Toby, any plans to come to India, and do you have currently India-based clients?
We don't have any India-based clients today. I'd be very happy to find some and for that to change. We have looked at the market a handful of times over the last 5 or 6 years, and what it would take is very simple. It's great. It's great business leaders looking for a partner like We Are Social, and supporting and great talent to lead the offering. I think that I have a lot of, and nothing to do with cricket, by the way, but a little bit to do with cricket. I would love the excuse to be visiting India more regularly, and perhaps you can, perhaps we'll go and watch a game one day. But it would be great if we could do that. We have nothing on the map at the moment between sort of continental Europe, the EU, and Dubai, and it's an obvious gap. So yeah, it's I can't say it's on the cards, but I would love to find a way.
Well, my best wishes to you, Toby, and your team. Great insights, great conversation. Thank you so much for being so kind with your time.
It's really great chatting to you. I love what you're doing, Vishal, and I love your passion and enthusiasm for the subject. I know this is like it's not the day job, but that doesn't come through because you're clearly a student and a passionate advocate and a believer. So the world needs more of us.
And that is a wrap. It's rare to talk to someone who can balance the rigor of a brand consultant with the agility of a social specialist, but Toby Southgate manages to occupy that middle ground effortlessly. Next week, episode 67 of the Indian AdGeek is going to be big and timely. Wait as I announce the guest on my X feed soon. If you've enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, leave us a review, drop a rating, and share it with someone who might enjoy it. The Indian AdGeek streams on all major podcast apps. Toby hasn't been active on X for a few years now, but I am at Vishal1 everywhere. Hit me up with your feedback. Until next time, keep your creative antennas tuned and your AdGeek flag flying high. Stay quirky, stay curious, and keep geeking out.